Parts of Being in Time were written by Martin Heidegger in a secluded cabin in the mountains of southern Germany. Being in Time has always been one of the most important books in my life. It was the book that made me fall in love with Heidegger. Because of that, this mysterious little cabin always felt like a special place to me. I looked at photos of it and imagined what it'd be like to stand there myself, and one day I decided to stop dreaming and finally go. I bought a ticket to Germany and headed to the Black Forest to see this place with my own eyes. I planned a small philosophical pilgrimage. I wanted to start in Freiburg, the city where phenomenology, one of the most influential philosophical movements of the 20th century, was born. Heidegger worked there as Edmund Husserl's assistant, and years later he was rector of the University of Freiburg for a brief period. For anyone interested in philosophy, it's a deeply symbolic place. Then I was going to visit Todtnauberg, a tiny village where Heidegger's cabin still stands. And finally, I wanted to visit Messkirch, Heidegger's hometown. That was my route, a small pilgrimage through the places connected with Martin Heidegger. I was incredibly excited for this trip, but the day before my flight, I checked the weather forecast and almost burst into tears. It was supposed to rain every single day. But there was nothing I could do. Everything had already been booked, so I accepted my fate and flew straight into a week of rain. As it turned out, what had seemed like terrible weather was actually perfect for this trip. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Freiburg lies near the borders of Switzerland and France, and even the airport serves 3 cities in 3 different countries: Freiburg, Basel, and Mulhouse. That meant I had the chance to visit Basel as well. Since this was a philosophical journey, I decided to keep it that way. Instead of visiting museums or wandering through shopping streets, I went to visit the grave of the German philosopher Karl Jaspers. Jaspers and Heidegger had once been close friends. Their letters to each other still survive and have even been published as a book. But after Heidegger joined the Nazi Party, their friendship slowly fell apart. Even so, they kept writing to each other, and reading those letters is heartbreaking. You can watch one of the greatest intellectual friendship of the 20th century slowly come undone. You can feel Jasper's disappointment and pain, because despite everything that happened, he never stopped admiring Heidegger's philosophical genius. Jaspers is buried in Basel. His grave is remarkably modest, just a simple stone set into the ground. And yet, standing there felt strangely meaningful. After spending a little more time wandering through Basel, I headed to my hotel. I deliberately chose to stay in Todtnauberg, the tiny village where Heidegger's cabin stands. Of course, I wanted to see Freiburg and Messkirch as well, but what truly brought me there was the forest and the cabin. Looking back now, staying in Todtnauberg was probably one of the best decisions I made on this trip. The place is unbelievably beautiful. And you can't imagine what it felt like when I finally arrived. I could hardly believe I was actually there, that I was standing in the place I'd imagined so many times.
I can't believe I'm here.
The next morning I woke up to this beautiful view outside my window, had a coffee, and immediately headed to Freiburg. It was exactly as I'd imagined it, a small university town, quiet and beautiful. The first place I visited was the University of Freiburg. At the entrance stand statues of Aristotle and Homer. Of course I went inside and wandered through the corridors for a while, pretending to be a student. It felt strange and exciting at the same time to walk through the same halls where Husserl and Heidegger once taught. I'm so jealous of the philosophy student who studied it today. I hope they realize just how lucky they are. I also visited the grave of Edmund Husserl, Heidegger's teacher and the founder of phenomenology. On the very first page of Being and Time, Heidegger dedicates the book to him. It was raining, and while I stood there, the church bell suddenly began to ring. I finally have a selfie with my celebrity crush. I also went to Husserl's house, the building where his apartment was located. It's a simple building, marked by a plaque and a couple of memorial stones set into the pavement for him and his wife. Honestly, it looked very modest, at least compared to Heidegger's house in Freiburg. Until this trip, I'd never actually seen his house in Freiburg. For me, Heidegger had always belonged to the forest cabin, so discovering that he lived in a magnificent villa came as a complete surprise. Outside, there's a memorial stone saying that Martin Heidegger lived there. The house itself looks well maintained, though the garden is little overgrown. It seemed that nobody lived there, which was probably for the best. It meant I wasn't disturbing anyone while I spent 10 minutes wandering around it out of sheer curiosity. Walking through Freiburg is difficult to describe. It is literally that city. I'd read about it countless times. I'd come across its name again and again in the books I'd read. And suddenly I was here. The streets I'd known only through philosophy had become real places beneath my feet. I spent the entire day wandering through Freiburg before returning to Todtnauberg, because the next day, finally, I was going to visit the cabin. And then the day finally arrived. The sky was still covered with clouds, but the moment I stepped into the forest, I realized how lucky I'd been with the weather. This area is called Schwarzwald, which means black forest. Wrapped in mist beneath the grey sky, it truly felt black, as if I'd stepped into fairy tale. If the entire forest had been flooded with sunshine, I think the experience would have been completely different. Instead, I found the black forest in its usual mystery, in fog and silence. We walked through forests and across open fields, stopped for lunch and passed cows. Everything felt incredibly peaceful. There is a trail called the Martin Heidegger Rundweg. It's a circular hiking route, about 6 kilometers long, that passes through the landscapes where Heidegger loved to walk. The cabin itself isn't directly on the trail. You have to leave the path at exactly the right moment. Fortunately, I'd prepared well for this trip. I'd studied photos and read everything I could find, so finding the cabin was easy for me. Along the route there were signs, information boards, and photos of Heidegger. To me that was astonishing. In everyday life I rarely meet anyone who even knows who Heidegger was. And here everything seemed to speak about him. It felt strangely comforting. The walk itself is beautiful. There are benches, quiet viewpoints, and places to stop and think. And who knows, perhaps Heidegger himself once sat on one of these very benches. And then finally I arrived. I'd crossed half of Europe just to stand here. And standing there for the first time, I could hardly believe I'd never actually been there before. I'd thought about this cabin so often that everything felt familiar. It all seemed a little unreal. But then I stepped into a deep puddle near the cabin, and that made me realize it was definitely real. It's an impossible feeling to explain. To finally stand beside the well I'd seen so many times in photos. I wish I'd brought a bucket with me. I could have recreated those famous photos of Heidegger. The cabin stands completely alone, surrounded by hills, and I couldn't help thinking how wonderful it would be to live here for a long time, to wake up here every morning, to spend your days walking through this forest. I didn't want to leave. I deliberately carried a bottle of local Black Forest beer with me. For some reason, I'd imagined myself drinking it here, sitting quietly for a while without saying anything, simply existing in that place. And that's exactly what I did. I sat there in silence, listening to the wind, and it was one of the most magical moments of my life. The final day of my journey brought me to Messkirch, Heidegger's hometown. This is where you'll find the Heidegger's museum, his childhood home, and the cemetery where he is buried. Heidegger's father worked for the local church, and the family lived near it, across from the Great Bell Tower. Heidegger even wrote a short text about this tower and the sound of its bells, and how they accompanied every day of his childhood. The bells still ring every hour. His childhood home still stands right in the middle. I stood there listening, thinking that every day of Heidegger's childhood had unfolded beneath that same sound, and now I was hearing exactly what he had heard. Standing in the yard where he grew up, I found myself imagining the young Heidegger running through the streets, hearing these bells and walking into this church. I also visited the Heidegger Museum nearby. It's a very small museum, mostly photographs, first edition of his books, manuscripts. Nothing extraordinary, but I still loved being there. I even discovered a few photographs I'd never seen before. For example, one of a young Heidegger wearing glasses. I had never seen him wearing glasses. He looked cute. And then came the final place, the true conclusion of my ontological pilgrimage, Heidegger's grave. He is buried in a small cemetery in Messkirch. His family members lie beside him. Their graves have crosses, but Heidegger's bears a star. They say he specifically asked for it. I sat beside his grave for a while. I wanted to thank him, to tell him a few things, to share some thoughts. Honestly, I hadn't expected this moment to carry any profound emotional weight. I simply wanted to visit his grave. But instead I ended up crying like the most sentimental fool imaginable. And I don't really know why, because I'm not an especially emotional person. And perhaps that was the perfect ending to the journey, a meeting with Martin himself, even if he now lies beneath the gravestone. Before the trip I thought the weather would ruin everything. Instead, the Black Forest revealed itself exactly as it was meant to. The forest welcomed me wrapped in mist and rain, like something from an old fairy tale. But on the day I arrived in Messkirch, the sky suddenly opened into brilliant sunshine. I stood beneath the bluest sky imaginable, listening to that same church tower. It almost felt as though each place had chosen the weather in which it wanted to be seen. Traveling through this region changed the way I understand Heidegger. His philosophy suddenly became inseparable from these landscapes. His early work, The Phenomenology of Religious Life, belongs to Messkirch, with its church, its bells, and its deeply Christian atmosphere. Being and Time belongs to Freiburg, with its university, its students, its intellectual energy. But the later Heidegger, the Heidegger of building, dwelling, thinking, belongs entirely to Todtnauberg, to the forest. Heidegger once wrote that solitude is not the same thing as seclusion. It's easy to be alone in a city, but almost impossible to dwell there in true seclusion. The city isolates by breaking connections, but seclusion does the opposite. It returns us to things themselves. And standing there in the Black Forest, I felt exactly that. I hope that one day I'll return here not simply as a visitor, but to stay for a while, to walk through the forest, to think, to write, to read, to forget that I came from somewhere else and, if only briefly, become part of this landscape. Heidegger's philosophy doesn't really live inside books, it lives here. And if you ever have the chance to visit this corner of Germany, don't hesitate. Go. It is pure magic.